This video is all about what is probably the most basic or simple form of distillation that you're likely to run into as a chaser of the distilling craft. We're talking about stripping runs. I'm hoping to answer all of your questions, clear up any issues you have, and let you go on your merry way so you don't have to worry about stripping runs ever again. How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I'm Jesse, this is Still It, and for a long time I've either made videos that talk a little bit about technique but are mostly sort of describing a recipe or a specific goal in distilling, or every now and again I just do a talky video that kind of gets a little bit geeky about a specific technique or idea in distilling. I'd like to change that up a little bit, and instead of having to make a product at the end of the day, I'd like to actually be distilling in videos, hands-on, show you what I'm doing, but the goal, the main purpose of the video is the technique. Today, we're gonna do that with stripping runs. Let's get stuck in. Don't stress out, we're gonna get stuck into the practical stuff real soon, I promise, but I think it would be advantageous, especially for the new distillers here, to have a little bit of context about what a stripping run is and why you would do it, so you can have that in the back of your mind when we talk through all of the rest of this. A stripping run, in my mind, is performed for three reasons, or it has three goals. The first is to cut down a large amount of wash into a more manageable volume that we can get through our stills, and doing so kind of makes the whole operation a little bit more economical. Number two is to raise the ABV from fermentation levels up to a point that's going to be advantageous for us later on. You'll note, I didn't say here, that higher is better, because it's not always. We'll talk about that later on. And number three, the last thing that in my mind is important with a stripping run is to preserve as much of the flavor from the wash as we can, because this isn't a scalpel operation, it's a bit more of a sledgehammer operation, and we want to mess around with the flavors, what we want, what we don't want, when we get to the scalpel side of things. That's another video. In a nutshell, distillers use stripping runs to cut down the volume of the wash so we can get it into our still easier later on, raise the ABV to help us out with kind of reaching our goals for our spirit runs. That comes later. And we try and preserve as much flavor as we can. So how do we do that? Generally speaking, this is going to be done with a Potstill. We're going to run the Potstill relatively hard and fast. We're more worried about speed, kind of economy at this scale, because being precise doesn't really affect anything. And we're not worried about cuts. We're going to keep absolutely everything and deal with that later on. Let's get into the equipment and the nitty-gritty. To run, perform, operate a stripping run, whatever you want to call it, you're going to need some equipment, right? You're going to need a still. Now, you could use, honestly, just about any kind of still for this you want. It's not a big issue, but like I said, we're kind of talking economy here, and we're talking simplicity, ease of use, so on and so forth for stripping runs. That means a pot still. What is a pot still? First of all, you're going to need a pot, a boiler, a container, a vessel, whatever you want to call it, something that we can put the wash into. The wash is the stuff we fermented and is ready to distill. More on that in a little bit. Pots or boilers come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes with all sorts of different bells and whistles. But at the end of the day, all it really needs to be able to do is hold our wash. Got plenty of room in there for that, that's sorted. And we need to be able to heat it. Once again, there's a bunch of different ways of going about this, but you might heat it with gas. Like so. A quick note on gas distillation. There's two things that stand out in my mind for beginners. One is safety. Yes, this can be a very, very safe, very, very reliable hobby, but you need to know that we're messing around with flammable substances here. If you've got a naked flame, I think you see where this is going, right? So you can do it. Yes, if you already have the equipment, it can be more economic for you to do so, but you need to be really, 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 really diligent with your safety side of things, okay? The other thing is too that depending on the equipment you've got, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to dial in the amount of energy going into the pot with gas. we're not worried about that for stripping runs. I just wanted to mention it, that this is totally a thing. If this is what you're using, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But today, I'm going to be using this, an electric element, which in a lot of ways is just a whole lot easier. Right, so this still has a tri-clamp and ferrule system that lets us get straight in there. This still is very modular and kind of gets everything put together with a tri-clamps and ferrules. So we can just take off the little plug that we'd use if we're going to heat this with gas, pop in the element, and hold it all together with a tri-clamp. If you're new to distilling, you may not have run across the whole ferrule gasket. There it is, tri-clamp system that's really, really popular for distilling. It basically means that we can put all of our distilling pieces together and take them apart like Lego, so we can have a bunch of different configurations. It kind of makes the equipment you have go further in terms of what you can do with it. So there's a ferrule on the end of, hold on, focus on this, not my face, camera. A ferrule on the end of the piece of equipment that we want to put together with a little groove in it. And that little groove is to accept the, get in there, the gasket, which is going to stop everything leaking, right? And then the other pieces of equipment all have the ferrules as well. So you can put this together in kind of any configuration as long as the ferrules are the same size. They go together like that. You'll notice the ferrules are angled, and that is to interact with the clamp. When the clamp goes around the piece of equipment we're using, the little grub screw or thumb screw or whatever you want to call it here pulls the clamp together closer this way, which pushes down on those angular pieces on the side of the ferrules, which pushes the two pieces of equipment together, or I guess holds them together. Super easy to take apart, put back together. You're not messing around with threading and unthreading things. I love this system. The next part of a pot still is essentially something to cap it or to hold all the vapor in at the top. Now, once again, these come in a bunch of different shapes, sizes, designs. Some stills, this is all incorporated and you fill from the side. But at the end of the day, we just want some way of holding the vapor we're going to create inside the pot, but once again, using a ferrule, directing it towards the column. For a pot still, the column does absolutely nothing fancy at all. It is literally just a tube that is going to direct the vapor where we want it. The shape of it, the size of it, for a stripping run, not really that important. Oh, I forgot too, we need a way of clamping this lid in place or holding it there. Not exactly safe to have it teetering on top, and if it's just sitting there or teetering or not kind of clamped down or sealed, we're going to lose vapor. We don't want to do that. The old school way of doing this is flour paste. You'd make a paste up with rye flour or even just standard like bread flour to the point where it's almost like Play-Doh. You'd push it into all the little gaps, and as the still heats up, it essentially cooks it, makes it not hard and solid, but enough to seal the pot. The next thing that all pot stills will have in common is a way to redirect this vapor. We want the vapor to be coming down towards the next part of the equipment we're going to talk about. So this is just two 90-degree angle bend stainless spool, once again with ferrules on the end. Once again, a lot of different stills will have different shapes for this. All of this might be one part, it might be kind of more molded, sculptorally, I guess you would call it. At the end of the day, all it needs to do is start directing the vapor back down to connect it with our condenser. Again, you're going to run into all sorts of different shapes and sizes of condensers. This is a shell and tube or a shotgun condenser. It's a container, a shell around the outside where we can pump water in. Water goes in one end, comes out the other end, and it flows through the entire kind of outside of this large pipe. The only place it doesn't get is inside the little ones. So the vapor is going to come in one end. It's going to be surrounded by cooler water. And as the vapor moves through here, it's going to be cooled down to the point where it's popping out the other end. Hopefully, if we're running it right, as a liquid. So this whole thing's basically full of slowly moving water, except for the tubes in the middle where the vapor goes. Cold water make hot vapor cold, cold vapor turn into liquid, to put it simply. Let's get this on the still as well. Not all stills will have this, but it is pretty common to have an adapter or a reducer, some sort of mechanism on the end of the condenser to basically make it easier for our offtake. So we're going to be collecting the distillate from this little thing rather than the big old part on the end of the condenser there. We have now built a Potstill. How does the damn thing work though? Essentially, you put the liquid in here, the wash that contains the alcohol and the flavors we want. We fill it up, we turn it on, we get it warm. It starts to boil and create steam. That steam will rise up through the pot, through the column, be redirected over the top here into the condenser, which will turn it back into a liquid, and we'll collect the liquid out the bottom. We'll have a little talk in a bit about why this is such a special thing and why it allows distilling to be possible. Let's get this thing filled up, which means, unfortunately, seeing as I'm a YouTuber and I did everything all backwards to show you guys what's up, we're going to take the lid off. All right, time to get some of this wash into our still. And for the purpose of this video, what I'm making here, the recipe of the wash really isn't relevant or important. If you're interested, I did make a video on it a little while ago because I knew some people would be. But the process of stripping, it's going to be the same no matter what you're making. You can, of course, get fancy with gravity feed systems or pumps or whatever to transfer wash from your fermenter into your still. Honestly, even with a big wash like this, I just always use buckets. One pot or bucket to scoop and one pot or bucket to transfer so I don't spill wash all over the place. And we can now pour this into the still. A couple of things to consider here. First of all, obviously, make sure that this is actually closed up. Valves are turned off if you have them. Blanks or plugs are in place. So when we pour this in, it doesn't go all over the floor. Bucket number 2. At this point, well, actually before this point, you really ought to be considering the kind of still you have and the texture of the wash as well. In a nutshell, there's a thing called scorching. If you have chunky bits floating around in the wash and the heat density of the way you heat the still up is too great, you're gonna end up burning something. I don't have that problem at all here. I strained out all of the chunky bits when I made the mash. Some stills, you know, like if you're making traditional bourbon, you're almost stilling it's almost more of a slurry or a solid than it is a liquid. But especially if you have exposed elements, you don't want almost any chunky granular pieces floating around in here. A lot of people like to crash or clear the wash and get the yeast out of suspension before they do this. Some yeasts require that, especially if you're using a turbo or something similar, you might want to consider it. This yeast is a proper whiskey yeast. It actually likes having a little bit of a murky wash go into the pot. I believe, and a lot of other people believe, it actually gives you extra good flavor. I'm not stressed about that at all. Let me get another one of these in here. Third bucket going in. So this is going to be just shy of about 30 litres. And this is a really good time to talk about puking. When you boil something, obviously bubbles are created, and when you boil a wash that has the right surface tension and protein content, it's going to make foam. The problem is, if we create too much foam too fast, so we're making foam in the wash faster than it's popping or dissipating, that foam just keeps building up and building up. It'll rise up right through this pot, all the way through the column, and just start spewing foamy nastiness out the other end. At that point, we're not distilling. We're basically just like percolating the wash over. It's not a good thing. For a stripping run, honestly, for the product side of things, it's not that big of a deal, but it will mean you're gonna have goop all through here that you're gonna have to clean out at some point. So there's a couple of things we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. The first, and in my opinion, the most important, is do not overfill the still. You probably want about maybe a quarter of the volume of the pot. reserved for headspace, so you have some room for foam to build up and dissipate. A quick note to say that almost all of the equipment that I'm using today is available at chasethecraft.com, but sorry team, only from America at the moment. We have 2 warehouses, one in America, one in New Zealand, and we're struggling to get the same products. We're working on it. We're struggling to get all the same products in both warehouses, so I don't have to do this weird spiel every time I bring it up. But if you are interested in the still or any of the other variations it comes in, and you're in America, chasethecraft.com. The next thing we can do is add something into the wash to adjust the surface tension of the liquid to help dissipate or pop all of those little foamy bubbles quicker. That's going to help us out. And I like to use just straight old butter. Think of a big old sink full of soapy, soapy water. If you pour a couple of teaspoons of olive oil or something in there, a lot of those bubbles are going to disappear real quick. Pretty much exactly the same thing happening here. And we can also add one of these bad boys into the still. This is a sight glass, same deal. Come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. The general idea is that it doesn't change the operation of the still at all. There's no plate, there's no packing, there's nothing in here. But what it does do is let us see into the column. And if you put that right at the base of the column, right at the top of the pot, we can see if we're starting to head towards a puke, we can combat that. Time to get the element plugged in. I'm using a controller that allows me to select percentage of power. In my opinion, it is just not a good idea to be running a Potstill, especially on a PID. So this gives me 0 to 100% power. I'm not picking temperature or anything like that. Let's get this plugged in, get the heat on, and set it to 100% to start warming up. Excellent time to get the water ready and our offtake ready. Let's deal to our water situation first. As you remember, this is a shell and tube or shotgun condenser. We want water flowing around the outside of those little pipes that the vapor is going to be coming down through. To be fair, if you're new to this, I've probably stitched you up a little bit. You want to get this sorted before you even fill the still up, just so you don't have the stress of you're on the clock to get this sorted. Obviously, there is a bunch of different ways to do this, but the simplest way is just to plumb it up with garden hoses. I always prefer on my product condenser to have the cold water going in the bottom and out the top. That means that we get a constant flow of water through the whole condenser. If it's trickling in the top, it might just drop to the back side of the condenser, flow all the way down, and you might only be utilizing half the condenser. It also means that the coldest water is down the bottom right next to the offtake, and that gives us a little bit more tweakability in terms of how we use the condenser. Garden hose number 1, this is going to be my in. I'm going to pop it on here. Unfortunately, it is pretty similar in diameter. So, nice little trick is to heat it up a little bit. Heat gun, paint gun, heck, you can do this with a lighter if you want to. And we'll hold that in place with a little hose clamp. Awesome. We'll do the same thing for the exhaust on the top. Water in coming in down here is plugged into the tap. Water out coming out of the top is, I'm just running it over to the sink. Obviously you can do whatever you want with this. Run it into a big reservoir and use it for watering the garden. Some people have big reservoirs that they pump through, so they're not they're not wasting water, not using water, they're just recycling it. It's up to you. But once it's all plumbed up, I 100% suggest turning it on at this stage to see if there's any leaks, because the last thing you want is discovering issues with the still as you're trying to run the still. Let me get this turned on. We'll make sure it's flowing through to the sink all right and not leaking. Awesome, water's getting through to the sink fine. I can feel that the condenser is cold to the touch, or not cold, cool to the touch. Groundwater temperature, funnily enough. And there's no leaks, so we're good to go on the water. Strictly speaking, you really don't need the water turned on at this point in time. If you're new to this, I can understand just turning it on and leaving it on to make sure you don't forget later on or get flustered with it. I generally turn the water on right before I know the still is going to start producing, or at the very least, I'll get the flow dialed into what I know I need. And knowing what you need in terms of flow, it's just really an experience thing with your equipment. All the equipment's different, your groundwater temperature will be different, so on and so forth. After you've done a few runs, it's one of those things that'll just kind of come second nature to you, I promise. So in summary, our still is built. We've got it full of wash. The wash is warming up. Our water's connected, either running or not running, personal preference at this point in time. But what we do know is that it's working properly and it's not leaking. The only issue we've got to sort now, before we're ready to actually settle into the run, is the liquid's going to come out of here. We need to catch it in something in a reasonable manner, I guess you'll call it. Because we are doing a stripping run. We're not making any cuts at all. We're going to keep everything that comes out of here to distill again later on. I like to use a big ass container, and then that way I don't have to worry about it overflowing, changing things. It's easier. It takes up less space in the distillery. Why would you not, right? So we could just put our big ass pot down here. But that's kind of ridiculous because there's going to be liquid dripping from here all the way down to there. It's going to splatter and splash, and it seems silly to me. So I always prop it up a little bit closer to the spout. As long as the top of the container is relatively close to the spout, I'm happy. That's about all there is to it. Another little tip of the hat to safety for the new distillers. We are in chill mode now. The still's set up, everything's running. I don't really have to do anything. All I'm doing is waiting for this to warm up. So it's a great time right now to just double check that everything's kind of as it should be. Is my collection jar in place? Yes. Is the water good? Yes. Is everything sturdy and solid? Nothing's going to tip over. This isn't flimsily balanced on something, and when liquid start going into it, it's going to tip over. Go through and check all your connections, make sure everything's done up tight, and just give the entire workstation a little once over, making sure that everything's mechanically sound, going through all the typical kind of fire safety like things. Make sure you're confident and ready to get into the run. A reminder, we're still running at 100% at the moment. Another one of those puke protection tips is to make sure that as soon as we're ready to actually start taking product off the still, we knock that down a little bit pretty quickly. How do we know? Well, we could just stand here and wait for something to start happening. I don't like being kind of passive with distilling. I'd rather be proactive. I want to know what's happening. And the easiest way to do that, in my opinion, is just to feel the still. Start at the top, because that's going to be the coolest. Don't go burning yourself now. So I run my hand down the column, feeling to see where it starts getting warm. It's still room temperature all the way down to here. This is all cold, kind of lukewarm. A little bit warmer at the top of the pot here. And then when you get to the liquid level, it's starting to feel pretty damn hot. It's uncomfortable to have my hand on there. So the way to read this is, when it gets uncomfortably hot at the top of the column, you are seconds away from liquid pouring out of the end here, or dribbling out at the very least. When you get down to the kind of the top of the pot, but the part of the pot that isn't all attached to something that's actually touching liquid, when that starts getting hot, you know you've got anywhere between, let's say, like 2 minutes and 10 minutes, depending on the size of the still and how much energy you're putting into the pot. So this right now is still, it's only just lukewarm here at the top. So I've got at least, I'm guessing, 10 minutes of waiting on this still. Just a nice little way to know when you have to be ready to start really paying attention to your still. I'll come back to you when it's starting to get warm around here. I need to say a huge thank you to the Patreons. Thank you, Patreons, for being the people that support us day in, month out. We totally freaking appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. Oh, and hey, guess what? Update. You know the shirt we're working on with Into the AM? They agreed to do the glow-in-the-dark green for us, which is pretty freaking exciting. I will put I'll share the final artwork on Patreon as soon as I can. 10, actually probably more like 15 minutes later, we're getting to the point where it's uncomfortably hot right about here and pretty damn warm up the top, so we're getting real close. I'm gonna bump the power down to 58%. Sure, somewhere around about half power is where I like to aim for. And the reason I wanna do this is because if we let this carry on cranking at 100%, the chances of us puking go way, way up. Actually, to show you what it's going to look like, how about I put it back to 100 for you? But the general idea with power on a stripping run is we want it as high as we can get it for as long as we can do so, simply because that's going to speed this process up and it really doesn't create a worse product at all. So, as soon as we're close to collecting temperature, okay, there we go, look, we've got drips. We're going to bump the power down, and that is going to help with that equilibrium of creating bubbles and letting bubbles dissipate. It kind of acts like a hot break when you're brewing beer. So the act of boiling it kind of uses up the potential to make bubbles. That's not really how it works, I don't think, but that's how I think of it. So if we just let it run at, say, 60% for maybe 25 minutes, and then bump the power up, we have a much, much greater chance of getting through the run without anything puking. Because we have the sight glass and we can see it, if you want to, you can just sort of sit here and watch it and run it at 100% until it starts dropping down. Entirely up to you, really just how quick you want to get through the run. But as soon as we've got drips coming off the still, there's another couple of things that we need to do to make sure that everything is running properly. The first thing is to touch the stream of liquor coming out of the spout and make sure that it is cool. The reason for that is we're just double checking that our cooling is working properly. We also want to visually check and potentially even nip up all of the parts where we've got pieces joining together. We're looking for leaks, any liquid coming out. Vapor is really hard to see, and it is a bit of a safety concern because chances are the vapor that's coming out of any one of these cracks, if there is a leak, will be flammable. And if you're in a confined space, not good. So make sure you're distilling with the doors open, the windows open, or in a large area or an outdoor area. One trick you can do is to use a cool, smooth, shiny surface. I'm looking for something on hand at the moment. You know what? My phone will probably work. And you can hold a glass, mirror, whatever it is, up around all of these cracks and look for fogging on the glass or the mirror, or in my case, my phone. I'm not seeing any. We're good. So now that we've got everything dialed in and running safely, I'm going to go back to this liquid and decide if it's being overcooled. Two reasons for this. One is you can end up with a slightly more sharp, spicy spirit if you're really knocking it down super hard in the condenser in terms of cooling power. And the second is we're just using way more water than we need to. And I think that is the case right now. This feels as cold as our groundwater, which is, I'm guessing, like 12 degrees Celsius here at the moment. And it doesn't need to be that cold. I like to aim for around about 20 degrees Celsius. That's kind of my sweet spot. So let me go and nip up that water tap a smidge, cut down the flow a touch, see if this readjusts. Beginning of a puke. That's why it's really helpful to have the sight glass in there. Well, actually, let me get a close-up of that with the phone before it gets too silly. The best thing to do when you're getting a puke is just kill the power straight away. Turn it off for like 30 seconds. You'll see how quickly that dropped out. I hope you can see that from there. And then turn the power down and start it up again. Once we're at this point, short of, pulling the still apart and taking some wash out or putting something else in there, really the only thing you can do is adjust the power. And obviously beware, because all of this stuff is really freaking hot now, so you can't just grab it and move it. But you should see real soon that the offtake is going to start up again, and hopefully that will stay under control. We're back up and running at 60% power, and we have spirit coming out the end here, which is good, and no sign of a puke. But this can kind of be a trap. It can sneak up on you. It could be, way down here, slowly building up, and it might take 15 minutes to get to this point. So having a sight glass is really freaking helpful if you're gonna sit here and baby it and watch it. If you don't have a sight glass, obviously you've got no idea what's going on, which is why I recommend running a stripping run like this for like 15, 20 minutes at a lower power and then slowly building it up. So I'm gonna give this another 5 minutes And then after that, every, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, I'll bump it up by about 5% power. And before long, well, let me come back to you in about 15 minutes and I'll tell you how we're going. I crept this up every couple of minutes for about 15 minutes. We've now been at 100% power for 10 minutes. I'm pretty freaking confident I can leave it at 100% now and let this run out. Now that we've got the puking aspect sorted, we're not worried about that anymore. By the way, have a look at the sight glass and I think you'll get an idea why we don't want that puking all the way through our still, so we don't have to clean the damn thing. But now that we have that sorted, let's have a talk about how fast you can run this thing. Like I said, we want to run the stripping run relatively hard and fast, purely from an economy of time point of view. And the two main things that are going to limit you are, 1, the amount of energy you can put into the pot, and 2, the amount of cooling or knockdown power that your product condenser is going to have. But the general idea is that you can keep turning the power going into the still up, be that, you know, on an electric controller, gas, more wood on the fire if you're going super old school, whatever it happens to be, until you get to one of 2 situations. Number 1 is you get to max power. Can't go more than max power, right? Unless you add another element or whatever. Number 2 is you're going to start getting really hot liquid or potentially even vapor coming out of the end of your condenser. If you get the first one, that's cool. Like, that's as fast as you can run it. And that's happening with me right now. There's only one element in this pot, 2 kilowatts to be precise. If you start getting quite hot liquid, and I'd say, you know, anything over about 30 degrees Celsius, you probably want to address the situation, or vapor. All you need to do is turn up the amount of fluid that's going into your condenser. Depending on the condenser, you're going to reach a point of real diminishing returns in terms of the amount of liquid that you put in here over time, like the flow rate and the amount of cooling that's actually going to happen. If the condenser is quite short, or it is a Liebig condenser, which is it's a shell and tube condenser as well, but there's only one tube going through the middle, that may well happen to you. This condenser has a real hefty amount of cooling / knockdown power, and it's handling 100%. Totally fine. In fact, my guess is that I would probably be able to run 2 elements on this still if I, you know, went through the hassle of DIYing that myself. It'd probably get pretty freaking close. So in other words, you can turn the power up and the water up if you need to the point where you're running this as fast as you can, but you still have properly condensed, cool-ish room temperature liquid coming out the end. You will also potentially notice that now that I've been running this still for a few hours, the offtake speed's dropped. The idea there is that we have collected a lot of the more volatile liquid into this pot, so it takes more energy. The liquid in the pot has to be at a higher temperature to keep boiling. That takes more energy. So if you are at a point where you have a little bit of headroom on your power controller, you can keep bumping that up slowly in small little increments throughout the run. Now that we're a solid way into this run, I can start thinking about when I want to stop. And honestly, for stripping runs, the easiest way to decide when to stop is with ABV. So let's have a look at that. This is a alchemeter. It's basically a hydrometer with a slightly different calibration and a different scale printed on the paper inside. The idea is that you float this in the spirit you're wanting to measure, and wherever the liquid intersects with the scale, that is the ABV that liquid is. Now, we could take a sample in a sample jar, like so. Once you have enough liquid in the jar that the alchemeter is actually floating, you can tell by just giving it a little tap on the top and watching it bob up and down. People often like to give it a little spin to make sure there's no bubbles on the outside of the alchemeter. And now we just take a very close look in parallax, so get down to the same level as the height of the liquid, and you want to read from the bottom of the meniscus where that crosses the scale. That is the ABV you're at. And just be aware that these guys do have often 2 scales on them. One is proof, one is ABV. Proof is just double ABV. I think at ABV, not in proof. Totally up to you. So this we have at about I'm going to say 13%. Another thing to keep in mind, team, is that these are calibrated to a certain temperature. This one is calibrated to 20 degrees Celsius, which just happens to be the temperature I like coming off my spout. Another reason to get that temperature dialed in. You don't have to mess around heating or cooling a sample or using calculators to dial it in. If you're out by 2 or 3 degrees, I wouldn't worry about it too much. By the time you're out by 5, 10 degrees Celsius, it can really throw your readings off. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking samples like this in a test jar. And to be honest, if I was doing a spirit run, not a stripping run, and I was going to use an alchemeter, this is probably the way I would do it. We'll talk about that more when we get into the spirit run video. But for the stripping run, we can use a Parrot. Now we have the distillate flowing into the collection side of the Parrot down to the bottom. It's rising up through the inner tube, spilling out into this little collection area, down through the spout, and into our collection jar on the other side here. What that means is that we can put our alchemeter down into the middle, and we can get a real-time reading. What that means is, as the still keeps running, this is going to keep updating us and telling us what the ABV is. The problem is it's not quite perfect. I guess the slight problem with Parrots, depending on what you're doing, is it's not going to be perfect, right? Like this drop that comes out of the still right now isn't going to stay all by itself and push all other drops ahead of it out. There is going to be some mixing and kind of smearing, people will often call it. For a stripping run, who cares? We're now down just under 10%. So if we're at 10% now, that probably raises a little question in your mind. When do we stop the stripping run? And there's no real hard and fast answer to this, but refer back to what we talked about in the very beginning. What's the point of a stripping run? It's to cut the volume down, it is to raise the ABV, and it's to retain flavor. And you may be thinking to yourself, how are we raising ABV if we're already down to 10%, which is right around the percentage that the wash was in the beginning? You're totally right, except for the fact that every other drip that's come out of the still so far has been at a higher ABV than it is now. And what we care about is the average ABV that's in this pot. We also want to cut down the volume, right? Well, we put 3 of these buckets in there, and we've got about probably 2/3, maybe a little bit more in this pot right now. So we're on track for that. We also wanted to preserve as much flavor as we can. And believe it or not, if you taste this, it can taste very, very bland, but there's still a bunch of flavor potential in this spirit at the moment. There's also just damn good alcohol. Like 10% of this liquid coming out now is alcohol. The point of distilling is to get alcohol. I don't want to waste this. So my general rule of thumb, and this is a rule of thumb, team, like, do you. But my general rule of thumb is that I will always, no matter what, when I'm doing a stripping run, go down to 15% ABV. And I'll stop at 15% ABV if it is 3 o'clock in the morning and I really need to go to bed and I just can't be bothered. I'll still get to 15% ABV. I'll get down to 10% if I'm feeling a little bit less lazy, but I'm still feeling pretty damn lazy. 5% is generally my goal for any run, like that's kind of my standard. And if I'm feeling industrious, or if it's something that I'm really trying to eke every little drip out of, or something where I think maybe there's a whole bunch of flavor sitting down in the bottom, I'll go down to about 2-3% ABV. So for this one, I'm thinking I'm probably going to call it at about 5% ABV. And while I've been sitting here yapping, we've dropped down to 9%. So we're heading in the right direction. Another 20 minutes later, and we're now down right around 5%. So all I need to do is turn off the power. This will slowly stop dripping. I'll give it about, I don't know, 30 seconds, a minute normally before I go out and turn the water off as well. Now, if you have a look in this pot, you may notice that it is a little bit grungy looking. That is totally normal for stripping runs. I actually just left a little bit of wash in the bottom of this pot. That's why this one looks grungy. But often you'll get a little slight coloration just purely from distillation. Don't stress about it. It's not a big issue. That'll be cleaned up in the spirit run later on. If you do get a slight puke, don't stress about it. It's not a big issue for the product that we're going to make from this. This isn't the finesse stage of distillation. That's going to come in the next video. We put 3 buckets that were pretty much full, or 3 of these big stock pots, I should say, into the still. That's how much liquid was in the still to start with. So we started with 3 times that, and now we are full to right around here with this run. So you're going to end up with somewhere around the third, probably a little bit less than a third of the volume that you put into the still. That's totally normal range for here. By the way, the stuff that comes out of the still on the stripping run, after it's been distilled once, is often called low wines. And this sort of 3rd to 4th kind of rule is why it's really, really popular to design recipes for mashes to be 3 to 4 times the size of the capacity, not filled to the tippy top, remember guys, we don't want it to puke, but the capacity of the still. So let's say I can fit, for easy math here, 50 liters of wash into my still. I'll make a wash recipe that is 150 liters. I'll do 3 stripping runs. I'll end up with probably about 40, 45 liters of low wines, which can go back into the still and be redistilled for the spirit run. It's just making the most of your equipment. Obviously, I have a much, much, much larger wash sitting here, but that's because I'm going to be doing extra stuff with it. So what I need to do now is empty the still out, fill it back up with more wash, and rerun it, and then do that again. So I'm ready to make a spirit run video with you guys next time. Oh, one last thing to talk about, team. Storing your low wines. If it's only going to be a couple of days that it's going to be sitting around before you do your spirit run, totally fine to put it in a container that just has a lid. Make sure it has a lid so you don't get too much evaporation. If it's going to be much longer than that, before you get to redistill it, you probably want to think about having a vessel that's actually sealed so you don't lose angel share before you even distill your product. And of course, now that we're starting to get up to a higher ABV, I'd really suggest that you only use plastic. Definitely not plastic. Stainless steel or glass to store it in. Keep anything that's rubber out of the way. We don't want that dissolving into our spirit. All right, team, I hope this has helped out some of the newer distillers. I hope this has helped out some of the people that are thinking about getting into this, but kind of get stuck in all the jargon when it comes at you hard and fast in the recipe videos. I'll catch you next time. Keep chasing the craft. See ya.